In 1888, Friedrich Nietzsche wrote 3 strategies in his private notebook that were so dangerous he labeled them forbidden because they would erase human weakness forever. He never published them during his lifetime. He was too afraid of what they might unleash. These weren't philosophical theories. These were practical psychological weapons that Nietzsche had discovered through years of studying history's most powerful figures: Napoleon, Caesar, Alexander the Great. Men who seemed immune to the psychological chains that bind ordinary people. But here's what nobody tells you about weakness. It's not what you think it is. Weakness isn't being physically small. It's not lacking confidence. It's not even failing. Weakness is a psychological contract you signed without reading the fine print. A contract that society needs you to honor so you remain predictable, controllable, and safe. Nietzsche cracked the code on how to break that contract completely. Napoleon used all 3 strategies to conquer Europe without ever reading Nietzsche. Tesla embodied them while revolutionizing electricity. But you've been programmed since birth to do the exact opposite. I call these strategies forbidden because once you truly understand them, you become ungovernable. You stop being manageable. You stop being a reliable vote, a predictable consumer, a compliant employee. You become dangerous. Here's what's going to happen in the next 20 minutes. I'm going to reveal Nietzsche's 3 forbidden strategies that don't just make you stronger. They make weakness literally impossible. Not unlikely. Impossible. But I need to warn you. Once you see these strategies for what they really are, you can't unsee them. And once you start applying them, there's no going back to your comfortable slavery. So let me ask you something. Are you ready to become ungovernable? Or are you going to keep pretending that your weakness is actually humility? Before I reveal the first forbidden strategy, you need to understand what happened to Nietzsche that led him to discover these principles. Because what I'm about to tell you will completely change how you see weakness forever. In 1879, Nietzsche collapsed, not physically, mentally. The brilliant philosopher, who would later write about strength and power, found himself so overwhelmed by social expectations that he couldn't function. Here's the shocking part. Nietzsche wasn't weak by any normal definition. He was a university professor at 24. He was friends with Richard Wagner, the most famous composer in Europe. He was intellectually gifted beyond measure, but he was psychologically enslaved. And in that moment of collapse, Nietzsche discovered something that would terrify him for the rest of his life. Most of what society calls strength is actually just sophisticated weakness. The successful businessman who needs everyone to like him, weak. The fitness influencer who measures his worth by followers, weak. The straight A student who's terrified of disappointing her parents, weak. But here's where it gets really insidious. And this is what Nietzsche figured out lying on his sickbed. Society doesn't just tolerate your weakness, it requires it. Your school needed you weak, so you'd follow the curriculum instead of questioning it. Your employer needs you weak, so you'll work for less than you're worth. Your family often needs you weak, so you'll conform to their expectations. This isn't conspiracy theory, this is human psychology. Weak people are predictable, controllable, safe. They make decisions based on what others think. They avoid conflict even when they're right. They say sorry for taking up space. And here's the part that will disturb you. They convinced you that this weakness is actually virtue, that being agreeable is nice, that avoiding confrontation is mature, that seeking approval is humble. Nietzsche saw through this lie completely. He realized that what society calls good is often just weakness wearing a mask. and what society calls selfish or arrogant is often just strength that refuses to apologize for existing. Now, you might be thinking, okay, but how do I actually break free from this? That's where Nietzsche's first forbidden strategy comes in. And I have to warn you, this one alone will fundamentally change how you see yourself and everyone around you. But that's not even the most dangerous part. Here's what Nietzsche discovered during his recovery that shocked him. Every single moment of weakness in his life could be traced back to one psychological error. He was making decisions based on who he thought he should be instead of who he actually was. Nietzsche called his first forbidden strategy radical self-ownership, but not how most people understand ownership. This isn't about taking responsibility for your actions. Any decent person does that. This is about something far more dangerous, taking complete ownership of your identity, your values, and your definition of success, regardless of what anyone else thinks, wants, or expects. Here's how Napoleon mastered this principle before he could even spell philosophy. Born into minor Corsican nobility, basically broke by European standards, Napoleon could have spent his entire life bitter about his circumstances. Instead, he made a decision that would terrify most people. He would define his own worth. When other officers mocked his Corsican accent, Napoleon didn't get defensive. He didn't explain his background. He didn't seek sympathy. He hired a speech coach and outworked them all. When his superiors told him to stay in his lane, Napoleon didn't argue with them. He simply decided their opinion was irrelevant to his vision of himself. That's radical self-ownership in action. But here's where most people get this completely wrong. And this is the part that makes this strategy forbidden. They think ownership means blaming yourself for everything. That's not ownership. That's just guilt with extra steps. Real ownership is what Nietzsche called amor fati, love of fate. It means looking at your life, all of it, the good and the terrible, and saying, this is mine. I claim it, and I will use every piece of it to become who I'm meant to become. Napoleon lost his father at 15. Instead of using this as an excuse for mediocrity, he used it as fuel for independence. Nietzsche suffered from debilitating migraines his entire adult life. Instead of surrendering to victimhood, he wrote, "What does not destroy me makes me stronger." Here's how you start implementing radical self-ownership today. Stop explaining yourself to people who didn't ask. When someone questions your choices, instead of launching into justification mode, simply say, "This is what I've decided." Full stop. Stop apologizing for things that aren't your fault. When your ideas make others uncomfortable, don't apologize. Clarify. Stop seeking permission for decisions that only affect you. Want to change careers? Don't poll your family and friends. Decide based on your vision and values, then inform them. But here's the part that separates the truly strong from the pretenders. Radical self-ownership means owning your failures completely without using them as identity anchors. Napoleon lost at Waterloo, catastrophically. He didn't spend the rest of his life explaining why it wasn't his fault. He owned it, learned from it, and maintained his identity as someone capable of greatness. This is why radical self-ownership is forbidden. Because once you truly own your life, you become ungovernable. You stop being manageable. You stop being a reliable employee, a predictable vote, a compliant citizen. You become dangerous. But I thought that was the most dangerous strategy, until I discovered what Nietzsche wrote about in his 1882 notebook. What I'm about to show you next makes radical self-ownership look like child's play. In 1882, 3 years after his mental collapse, Nietzsche wrote something in his private journal that he would never speak about publicly. something so psychologically dangerous that even he was afraid of its implications. He had discovered that transformation isn't about adding new qualities to yourself. It's about systematically destroying the parts of yourself that no longer serve your evolution. He called it creative destruction, the art of intentionally killing aspects of your identity to create space for who you're becoming. And here's what made this discovery so terrifying. Nietzsche realized that most people are psychologically incapable of voluntary self-destruction. They would rather stay weak and familiar than become strong and unknown. Napoleon embodied this principle without knowing its name. When he became emperor, he didn't try to add imperial behaviors to his existing personality. He systematically destroyed the parts of himself that no longer served his vision. Gone was the young officer who sought approval from superiors. Gone was the Corsican outsider who felt he had to prove he belonged. Gone was the artillery specialist who thought in small-scale tactics. He didn't just change, he underwent what Nietzsche called self-overcoming. He killed old versions of himself to birth new ones. Here's what makes this strategy forbidden. It requires you to voluntarily destroy things that feel like you. Your old beliefs, your comfortable patterns, your familiar limitations. Most people think growth means addition, adding new skills, new knowledge, new habits. But Nietzsche understood that real transformation requires subtraction, strategic destruction. Think about it. You can't become a confident public speaker while holding on to your identity as someone who's just not good at speaking. You can't build wealth while maintaining your beliefs about rich people being evil. You can't create anything revolutionary while clinging to your need for everyone's approval. Something has to die for something greater to be born. Here's how creative destruction works in practice. First, identify what you need to destroy. This isn't about eliminating personality traits you dislike. This is about recognizing which parts of your current identity directly conflict with who you're trying to become. If you want to build a business, you might need to destroy your employee mindset, the part of you that waits for someone else to tell you what to do. If you want to create art, you might need to destroy your perfectionist identity, the part of you that would rather create nothing than create something imperfect. Second, create destruction rituals. Napoleon literally burned his old uniforms when he became emperor. Nietzsche wrote about his philosophical evolution as a series of deaths and rebirths. You can write down the beliefs, habits, or identities you're releasing and literally burn the paper. You can pack away clothes, books, or objects that represent your old self. Third, resist the urge to resurrect what you've destroyed. Your old self will try to come back. It's familiar. It's comfortable. It feels authentic. But Nietzsche understood that authenticity isn't about staying the same. It's about becoming who you truly are, not who you've always been. This strategy is forbidden because it challenges the fundamental lie that your personality is fixed, that change is gradual, and that you should just be yourself. But even creative destruction pales in comparison to Nietzsche's third strategy. What he discovered about human potential in 1885 was so revolutionary that it would influence psychology for the next 150 years. In 1885, Nietzsche made a discovery that would become his most dangerous idea. He found it buried in his analysis of history's greatest figures, from Alexander the Great to Leonardo da Vinci to Napoleon. He discovered that true strength has nothing to do with dominating others and everything to do with something far more terrifying: the relentless drive to become the highest expression of your potential, regardless of what anyone else thinks, wants, or expects. He called it will to power. And here's why it's the most forbidden strategy of all. It makes you completely independent of external validation. Napoleon embodied this completely. Even in exile on St. Helena, when he had lost everything, his empire, his army, his freedom, he continued studying, writing, planning. Not because he thought he'd return to power, but because the drive to grow and create was more fundamental than any external circumstance. That's will to power. It's not situational. It's not dependent on success or failure, approval or rejection, good times or bad times. It's the unshakable commitment to your own evolution. Here's what makes this strategy forbidden. It requires you to stop caring about outcomes and start caring only about the process of becoming. Most people tie their identity to results. I'm successful because my business is growing. I'm attractive because people find me attractive. I'm intelligent because I got good grades. But results are largely outside your control. Markets crash, people's opinions change, tests can be unfair. Will to power means anchoring your identity in something no one can take away, your commitment to growth itself. Nietzsche wrote, "He who would learn to fly one day must first learn to stand and walk and run and climb and dance. One cannot fly into flying." Napoleon understood this intuitively. Even when he was losing battles, he was learning from them. Even when his strategies failed, he was developing new ones. Even when his empire fell, he was already mentally rebuilding. Here's how to cultivate genuine will to power. First, redefine success as growth, not achievement. Ask yourself daily, how did I become more today than I was yesterday? Not more successful, more wealthy, more popular, more. Second, embrace what Nietzsche called eternal recurrence, the idea that you should live as if you'll repeat this exact life infinite times. Would you be proud to repeat today forever? Not because of what you accomplished, but because of who you became in the process. Third, develop what I call outcome independence. Commit fully to your goals while remaining emotionally detached from specific results. Napoleon planned his campaigns meticulously, fought with everything he had, but wasn't devastated by losses because his identity was anchored in his strategic evolution, not his win-loss record. Fourth, practice what Nietzsche called self-legislation, creating your own values instead of adopting society's. What do you stand for? What principles guide your decisions? What kind of person are you committed to becoming? This is terrifying to most people because it means you can't blame your parents, your circumstances, your genetics, or your bad luck for who you become. You become the sole author of your life's meaning. But it's also liberating beyond anything you can imagine. Because once you anchor your identity in will to power, you become literally unstoppable. Not because you always win, but because you always grow. Now here's what nobody tells you about implementing these three strategies. So here we are. You now understand the three forbidden strategies that Nietzsche discovered and that history's most powerful figures have used to transcend ordinary human limitations. Radical self-ownership, taking complete responsibility for your life while refusing to be defined by your circumstances. Creative destruction, intentionally destroying parts of yourself that conflict with who you're becoming. Will to power, anchoring your identity in growth itself, not in outcomes or other people's opinions. But here's what I haven't told you yet, and this is crucial. These strategies only work if you understand the psychological sequence for implementing them. Most people try to apply all three at once and end up overwhelmed. Others focus on just one and wonder why they're not seeing results. But there's a specific order, a precise methodology that Nietzsche discovered for integrating these strategies into your daily life. There's also something darker that Nietzsche wrote about, the psychological resistance you'll face, not just from others, but from your own mind. What he called the last man, the part of you that will fight tooth and nail to keep you exactly where you are. And there's the question of what comes after. Because once you've mastered these 3 strategies, once you've become truly ungovernable, then what? What does Nietzsche say about the next stage of human evolution? These are the questions I address in my next video, where I break down Nietzsche's secret methodology for psychological transformation. The step-by-step process he developed for moving from weakness to what he called the overman. Because understanding these 3 strategies is just the beginning. Implementing them correctly, that's where the real work starts. The question is, are you ready to do the work? Or are you going to let this knowledge become just another piece of entertainment? The choice, as Nietzsche would say, is entirely yours. Thank you for watching. See you in the next dimension. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe and make sure to check out one of our most recent videos.